So we're going to wrap up existentialism here. I know I told you I'd do this video several days ago and just now getting to it. So we'll finish up existentialism and then we'll decide where we go from there. I think on the last one we kind of talked all the way down through number 6 here, and I'll just wrap up by saying a quick thing about number 7. Kierkegaard proposes this notion of the leap of faith. Some of you know that that's a Kierkegaardian idea, but almost everybody in Western culture has heard the phrase leap of faith. Well, Kierkegaard proposes that in Fear and Trembling, and he says that basically that's what faith is, that faith is a step out into the darkness. And Kierkegaard and his whole use of the story of Abraham going up the mountain with Isaac is this story of someone who's stepping out in faith, stepping into this darkness with no real clear sense that God will catch them, but with the sense that even if they fall, it will somehow ultimately be okay. So it's not so much a point of well, it's kind of a thin, subtle distinction, but the way I sometimes illustrate this in class is to have someone come up and sit in it, pull out a chair and say, okay, now sit in this chair, and use the thing that happens sometimes in church youth groups in those situations where somebody says, okay, do you believe in this chair? And we can say, well, yeah, we believe in the chair. And then I'll say, well, how do you show me that you have faith in the chair? And inevitably someone will say, well, you prove that you have faith in the chair by sitting down in the chair, putting your weight on the chair, trusting the chair to hold you up. Well, then what I typically would do is pull the chair away and then point to the place where the chair was and say, okay, now I want you to sit in the chair. And of course no one will sit in a chair that they can't see. And that was Kierkegaard's point, was that the leap of faith is not like being able to see a chair and then trusting the chair to hold you. The leap of faith is more like someone saying, yeah, there's a chair right there, and you look and you can't see the chair, and yet you sit anyway. You have faith that somehow it will be okay. Even if you fall, it will be okay ultimately. And so Kierkegaard's notion of faith as a leap into the void, a step out into darkness, is not the idea that I'm going to step out there in the darkness and I know that God will catch me. The idea is I'm going to step out there in the darkness and I really don't know if God will catch me, but I know that ultimately, okay, eternally, it will be okay. So if God asks me to step out there, I'm stepping out totally in faith, in absurdity. I can't see God. I don't know for absolute certain that God is there, but I step anyway because God asks me to, which is what Abraham does when he walks up the mountain with Isaac. So Kierkegaard throws this little twist into the concept of faith, and one of the reasons I really like Kierkegaard is because I really think that this idea of faith is much more in line with what Christian people should say their faith is and what we should strive for. Not the faith that says, I see a chair there and so I'll sit in it and trust it, but the faith that says, well, God asked me to step out there and I really don't know if I'll fall or not, but I step anyway. Okay? And this is what, Kierkegaard called the teleological suspension of the ethical. I don't know what's going to happen, but because of the teleology, the end game, I'll do whatever I'm asked to do without regard to what happens to me. So there's Kierkegaard. Now, when we look at Kierkegaard, again, let's look at the dates here, 1813 to 1855. If we look at Nietzsche, Nietzsche comes along a little bit later. They cross time a little bit. Nietzsche's born in 44 and lives to 1900. Now, Nietzsche has this interesting and really sad kind of life. Nietzsche is a son of a minister. Be sure that you read the history of him in your text. He's a son of a minister. He he grows up in this environment that he grows out of that into this other person in a really dramatic kind of fashion, and lives this life where he becomes convinced that part of our enormous problem is the focus on rationalism that's become such a part of European culture, especially German culture. And so with Kant and all of those people that came before Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche is convinced that we rely way too heavily on rationalism. He lives this kind of sad and desperate life, really, if you read his story. He ends up developing syphilis, and probably has serious brain damage because of the syphilis, and ends up dying in an institution because his brain probably just kind of gets eaten away. So it's a sad kind of story, but before all of that, before he kind of deteriorates, he is a very prolific writer and thinker. So here's some of Nietzsche's most significant ideas. Number 2 on the list there is that he proposed that we have both an Apollonian and Dionysian nature, the rational and the irrational. And if you look at your text, I think it's page 209, at least as it is in my book, there's a decent discussion of Apollonian and Dionysian nature. This is where Nietzsche says we've relied too much on the Apollonian nature. We've become too rational. And not that there's anything really wrong with being rational, but the problem is we have ignored our Dionysian nature, the romantic, the exciting, the passionate, the unplanned, the spontaneous, that part of us that allows us to just dive into life, to just embrace everything that happens in life. And Nietzsche believed that we have become so rational in our thinking and our approach to life. And remember, he's living in a Germany that's post-Kant and all those people. He says we're not living life. We need to embrace life. We need to embrace everything that feels good, that's exciting, that tempts us, that excites us, that we're passionate about, and that the happiest person, the healthiest person, was a person who had this kind of balanced life where they had the rational, but they also had the irrational. And he believed that the ultimate place for a person to be was to live with this kind of controlled or tempered Dionysian nature. Not just completely loose with no Apollonian nature, but kind of a controlled, irrational self. So that's part of why that's again part of why Nietzsche is an existentialist, because he kind of fights against that German rationalist kind of thinking and says we need more than that to be alive, to be fully human. Now, Nietzsche also says, like Kierkegaard, that man's biggest problem is his loss of self, his loss of his sense of self. The difference, of course, is that Kierkegaard believes that to find ourself, to understand ourself, to gain this sense of identity or self, what we need to do is see ourselves as up against the ultimate, up against God. Okay? Nietzsche says that to find ourselves, we basically need to become our God. We need to become what we have the potential to be, which down at the bottom you can see there, we'll talk about it in a minute, he calls the Superman, the Übermensch, the best person that we can be, the best me that I can be. Okay. So both of them have this notion that we have this loss of a sense of self, that Nietzsche says we're lost, we have no direction, we have no goal, we have no passion, we have no we don't know how to live life. And the answer to that is the will to power, to embrace choice, to embrace freedom, and to become the Superman. Okay? In other words, we become our own savior. All right. So Nietzsche also, as a part of all of that, proposes God is dead. I talked about that earlier with Kierkegaard. Nietzsche says God is dead and we have killed him. Kierkegaard kind of proposes that we try to kill off God, but he remains. Nietzsche says, no, God is dead. and because we've destroyed him, we've gotten rid of him. If you look at on page 210, there's a section there on the death of God. Nietzsche, he writes this in The Gay Science. He says, God is dead. He says, they've done it themselves. And he asks, is man just one of God's mistakes, or is God just one of man's? In any case, Nietzsche announced that God was dead and that we had killed him. By we, he meant the philosophers and scientists, because we had relied on God for so long for ultimate meaning, we are lost now that we've gotten rid of him. So Nietzsche kind of paints this picture of how humanity for hundreds and thousands of years has relied on God for truth, for meaning, for substance, all of those things. And then we come along with philosophy and science and we say we don't need God and God doesn't exist. We become rational and scientific. And so Nietzsche says once those two things have happened, we relied on God for years and years and years and years, and then we said we don't need God. God is dead. God's not important anymore. Kant says, remember, that the mind becomes the center of the universe. Well, Nietzsche says once we did that, we're totally lost. We don't know what to do because we've killed God off. God is dead to us. Okay. In fact, I think if I was going to paraphrase it, and of course, I wouldn't want to say that I know how to do this, of course, better than all of these translators. But when I read this, I think of somebody saying God is dead to us, as opposed to just God is dead. Because what Nietzsche's saying is we've killed him because we decided we didn't need him. Okay. So now Nietzsche doesn't say that the answer to that is to resurrect God. Nietzsche says the answer to that then is to become our own God. And he says we do that by embracing power, embracing choice, embracing freedom. One of Nietzsche's most significant ideas is the will to power. And that's on page 211 in your text. That's a weird phrase because, of course, it's a German phrase that we turn to English, and it doesn't sound right to us. But Nietzsche says this is the most basic human motive, the will to power. It can only be satisfied if a person acts as they feel. That is, they act in such a way as to satisfy all instincts. The will to power is the primitive motive force out of which all other motives have been derived. The only reality is this, the will of every center of power to become stronger. Okay? Not self-preservation, but the desire to become master, to become more, to become stronger. Okay? So Nietzsche proposes that that's our most significant drive. That's what pushes us. That's what gives us passion. That's what allows us to really live life the way we're supposed to, is to embrace this notion of the will to power, that we are pushed to overcome, to become the masters of our own life. Okay? Now, in doing that, then, we become the Superman or the Ubermensch. Now, Superman is also weird for us because you and I can't think of Superman without thinking of the guy in the red cape flying through the air. But for Nietzsche, of course, it has nothing to do with that. Nietzsche says, and also Sprach Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, I teach you the Superman. Man is something that should be overcome. Okay? Behold, I teach you the Superman. The Superman is the meaning of the earth. The Superman shall be the meaning of the earth. Okay? This Ubermensch might be higher man, better man, overman. Okay? Someone who is the ultimate of what a person can be. So Nietzsche proposes that we need to embrace the irrational with the rational. He proposes that we are lost. We're totally lost. And one of the reasons we're lost is because we had depended on God for centuries, and now we killed God off with philosophy and science, and now we have nothing. We're lost. And so the answer to that is to become all that we can become, to become the Superman or the Ubermensch. Nietzsche is famous for saying some things that sometimes people don't know Nietzsche says. This notion that I become my own God leads him to this phrase, physician, heal thyself. That's Nietzsche saying, don't look to someone else. Don't look to that old idea of God. Don't look to other things to fulfill you. Become your own physician. Heal yourself. Become the ultimate of what you can become. Nietzsche also says this other thing that shows up on posters and t-shirts, and people don't know that it's Nietzsche. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. Is it Kelly Clarkson that did that song? I don't know, but I don't know if Kelly Clarkson knows that's Nietzsche or not. She probably does, but a lot of people might quote that and they don't think, oh, I'm quoting an atheist existentialist philosopher, but that's Nietzsche. And Nietzsche believed that everything that happened just moved you, at least gave you the opportunity to move closer and closer to the Superman, to becoming all that you could become. Now, Kierkegaard and then Nietzsche set the stage for existentialist thinking. And then we have all these other people who come along who are influenced by these thinkers and then offer their own kind of influence in lots of different ways. A couple of them that I know you're familiar with. Number one, Viktor Frankl. Frankl produces the concept of logotherapy. And logotherapy is about overcoming our anxiety and embracing freedom and discovering meaning. It's about no matter, and you know, probably a lot of you know, Frankl kind of developed this as part of his experience with the Holocaust. And he saw firsthand what happened to people, and he saw people that within concentration camps maintained their integrity, maintained their sense of value and meaning. And he said they did that by embracing choice, embracing that freedom that they had to behave no matter what the circumstance. And so Frankl is heavily influenced by existential thinkers like Kierkegaard and even Nietzsche, although Frankl has a theological foundation that Nietzsche doesn't quite have. Rollo May, also a therapist, and if you haven't ever read it, those of you who want to be therapists, you should read Rollo May's little book called The Art of Counseling. It's old, but it's very, very pertinent. May proposed that what really happens in therapy that's important is the encounter between two people. This encounter becomes one of the hallmarks of existential therapy and existential psychology, that what is important is when we have that relationship, that we find out who we are in relationship. Very much like Kierkegaard said, I only know who I am in relationship to God. Well, existential therapists then take that idea of the encounter with the other as a foundational part of therapy, so that if I sit in a therapy room with a person, I can have skills and I can have techniques and I can have counseling theory, but what's most important about therapy is the encounter between two humans. The fact that I sit and look at another person and listen to them and they listen to me, and we have this relationship that develops, and that's the essence of therapy for people like Rollo May. May proposes in his book Love and Will that we are influenced by what he calls the daimonic, which May decided that he didn't like the concept of devil or demonic as kind of the bad influence in life. And so he used this word daimonic, which is a bit broader than saying I'm afflicted by demons, or the devil is making me do something, or Satan is attacking me. The daimonic for May was broader than that, and it was a little bit more like saying it's the part of me, it's that force within me that pushes me sometimes to do things that are not the best. But he even tweaks it a little bit from there. The daimonic is a little hard to grasp, but May kind of replaces the religious concept of the devil or Satan or demons with this idea of the daimonic, and he kind of uses the term these little gods, little demons that afflict us. and that push us and prod us. And so the daimonic becomes a part of May's notion of how do we embrace responsibility and embrace freedom and those types of things. Freedom for Rollo May becomes the goal of therapy, to be able to embrace freedom and embrace the responsibility that comes with it. For May, if you could get someone to do that, then you've done good therapy with them. So we have therapists that are influenced there. We also have lots of theologians that are influenced by existentialists. Some Christian, some Jewish. One of those most recognizable ones, those of you who've had some theology, is Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich and Karl Barth are two of the most influential German theologians that influenced Christian theology in the West, and they're both influenced by existentialists. Tillich says, for example, to recognize itself, the soul has to recognize who it is in God. And he says that our anxiety, Tillich writes a whole book about anxiety, and he says our anxiety is the result of our sense of being finite in the face of a being that is infinite. And that when we see that, when we realize, oh, I am finite, and the way I know that is because I can experience the infinite in God, then I realize that I have the possibility of non-being or non-existence, and I have this thing that becomes known as the existential crisis, when I realize my existence is not guaranteed forever. Okay? And I know that because I've realized that there is an infinite, eternal being, and it's not me. I am not infinite. So when we realize that, we begin to know who we are, and we begin to be able to deal with our spiritual anxiety. Karl Barth, as I mentioned a while ago, also in this same kind of vein. Barth said man must exist as a being with, or a being in encounter. That's the way that we know who we are. And Barth says that that's illustrated biblically in the covenants that God makes. The Old Testament covenant, and then Jesus is the new covenant. That says this is how God tells us who we are, through setting up these relationships with us. And we only have existence in our relationship to Christ. And that's clearly a Kierkegaard idea, but it shows up in Karl Barth, 100 years later. So Barth even takes this notion of the image of God, man and woman being created in the image of God, or in Latin it's the imago Dei. And Barth says the imago Dei is not a reflection. It's not like we can say, oh, we're like God in this way. But he says the imago Dei is not a reflection of God, but it's a relationship that says I relate to God. Being made in his image is indicative of a relationship, not of a mirror-like reflection. And that's the only way that I'm genuinely, fully human, is when I realize that I am in the imago Dei, I am in the image of God. Not to say in any way that I'm like God. Sometimes people take that and they say, well, that man being in the image of God means that we have an eternal soul, and that's like God in that it's eternal. Well, Barth might argue with that and say it's really not about that. It's not about being able to say, look how man is like God. It's really about saying man is only real, only human, only exists in relationship to God, within that image of God. It's almost like we are in the scope of God, okay? And that gives us a sense of who we are. That gives us identity. The last person I'll mention in here is a Jewish theologian, Martin Buber. Some of you may have heard of Buber before, but Buber does the same thing with Jewish theology. He says man exists only in distance and relation. That's how we know who we are, because of our closeness to something, or our relationship, or our distance to something. And that humanity only shows up in relationship. Okay, and that and he also then says our greatness, being who we are, being who we possibly can be, reaching our potential, is all caught up in our misery and our pain and our suffering. And that's the way that we can recognize who we are. We can't just embrace the good. We have to embrace our pain and our suffering and our struggle, our misery, and only then can we recognize and see who we are. Okay? And so existentialism, coming mostly from Kierkegaard and then from Nietzsche, and then there are some others later, but those two really influence significant theologians who really give us some foundational ideas for even contemporary Christian theology, and they also influence very strongly some notions of therapy that still show up in a lot of therapeutic models today. So that's our look at rationalism and existentialism.